In the time before the dark, there was only light. Till the yawning veil fell across the sky, separating space and night, leaving us in awe of the infinite shadow, that behemoth, that monster. But from the waning of the light, our world was formed, another broken, with enough night left to dream by.
You know, when I was a child, I realized that my parents were Buddhists, but I was raised as a Presbyterian. And so I realized that there were two conflicting points of view. In Buddhism, there is no God, there's no beginning, there's no end, there's only timeless nirvana. But in the Presbyterian Christian tradition, there is Genesis. God said, let there be light. How can you combine Genesis with nirvana? Impossible, right? Nope. You can combine it with the multiverse. You see, our universe did have a beginning. Our universe had a big bang. There was a Genesis. But our universe is not the only one. It coexists simultaneously with the multiverse of universes, and therefore they are bubbles floating in nirvana. So today we think that string theory is the only theory that can unify the big and the small. And it basically says that everything around us is like music, that everything we see around us is vibrating, and these vibrations correspond to subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are nothing but notes on a tiny vibrating string. What is physics? Physics is the harmonies you can write on these vibrating strings. What is chemistry? Chemistry are the melodies you can play on vibrating strings. What is the universe? The universe is a symphony of strings. And then what is the mind of God? The mind of God is cosmic music resonating through 11-dimensional hyperspace. So what we see around us is actually an illusion. We're only looking at the tiniest sliver of what actually exists. Our 3-dimensional world is not really the world at all. We've been hoodwinked.
If we think of this reality as like a television channel, like a holographic television channel, we're only seeing the frequency that channel operates on. The electromagnetic spectrum is not what we conceive, and yet that's what 0.005%, they say, of what exists in this universe. Visible light is only a fraction of the 0.005%, and that's all we can see. So we operate on a particular frequency band, just like a radio station and a television station in the analog system. But outside of that is an infinity of possibility, an infinity of other forms of life that take a very different form to us. And some of them are just energetic. They don't have a form. They're just awareness. It's interesting that for me, one of the greatest forms of human control is the suppression of the sense of the possible. Because once you have a situation where you have persuaded people that only this is possible, then anything that you're doing outside of that sense of the possible will be rejected by reflex action. They can't be doing that. It's not possible.
Growing up in Hollywood movie sets, I was introduced at a very young age to the mystery of consciousness, because movies, like magic, manipulate our senses, our minds, our feelings. They make us question the very nature of reality. For instance, it takes months, if not years, to create an experience that literally lasts for only a few minutes of your time. Humans, playing fake characters with real emotion, create a self-contained fictional universe that lives on, like a parallel universe, even after you're done watching it. And if you're watching this, then we're having a multidimensional experience of many different timelines, all coinciding at this moment. But the director, like a magician, decides what you get to see and where the frame ends. And that's where I want to go.
"7 years ago, I started an interview show called Buzzsaw that was spawned from my work with Tyrell and Jesse Ventura on the TV series Conspiracy Theory.
You guys gotta be kidding me.
I grew up with that term, conspiracy theory, surrounding me.
The Oliver Stone, George Bush connection, Oliver Stone?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, he's their spokesman. Yeah, I mean, you think if anyone had the information that he's got and had a national podium to shout it from, that they'd actually let him do it? No, it's quite clear that he's a disinformation junkie for him.
While I doubt my father worked for the CIA, as a Vietnam veteran, he passionately sought to understand how a system could send hundreds of thousands of young men to be sacrificed. Despite the media reassuring us that the President of the United States is the most powerful man in the world, the decision maker, my father saw a deeper state behind the scenes.
You say you want to end the war, so why don't you?
Change always comes slowly. I pulled out more than half the troops. I'm trying to cut the military budget for the first time in 30 years. I want a volunteer army, but it's also a question of American credibility, our position in the world.
We don't want the war. The Vietnamese don't want the war. So why does it go on?
We should be going, Mr. President. Okay. Please.
You can't stop it, can you? Even if you wanted to. Because it's not you. It's the system. The system won't let you stop it.
19-year-old college kid. What? She understood something that's taken me 25 years in politics to understand. The CIA, the Mafia, those Wall Street bastards. Sir? The beast. 19-year-old kid. She called it a wild animal. Yes, sir.
He called that system the Beast, after W.B. Yeats's poem.
But it ends so beautifully ominous. What rough beast? Its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Yes. This country stands at such a juncture.
And it reminded me of the words of Paul to the Ephesians, "Put on the full armor of God, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the archons, against the authorities, against the powers of this world's darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." But how did I come to such a metaphysical conclusion? I think my path was similar to that of Ted Gunderson, who was at one time a candidate for director of the FBI.
I retired from the FBI March 1979. At that time, I was in charge of the FBI Los Angeles division. I had more than 700 personnel under my command.
When I first came out of the FBI, as I said, I came out in 1979. Attorney General Griffin Bell hired me to coordinate security for the Pan American Games. And I came back and started my own international security consulting firm in Los Angeles, California. And I was a consultant for the '84 Olympics in Los Angeles. And one of my first cases that I handled, I was contacted by some of Dr. Jeffrey R. McDonald's doctor friends.
What happens when a narrative takes the place of reality?
The infamous crime happened back in 1970.
Dr. Jeffrey McDonald has been charged with the murders of his pregnant wife and their 2 young daughters. McDonald blamed the crime on a group of hippies.
Either Jeffrey McDonald slaughtered his family and then tried to hide that fact, or there were intruders imitating the Manson family, including a girl with a floppy hat who attempted to kill him and killed his family.
It's not the kind of guy who does this.
This case had so much publicity. It was on the headlines every day.
A best-selling book, the miniseries.
The television movie Fatal Vision.
Millions of people saw Jeffrey McDonald killing his family. It solidified people's views about the case.
Does it seem strange to you that no one else has confessed?
It's not really quite accurate to say that no one has confessed.
According to Helena Stokely, I obtained a confession from her. On October 25, 1980, I brought her back to LA. That's a story by and of itself. And Helena Stokely told me that it was her satanic cult group that went into the house that night. And it was her initiation into the group. And I said, what is this all about? And that was really the first I learned about Satanism.
He told Mr. Beasley also in 1980 that one of the high priorities in human sacrifice was a pregnant woman for this group. Is that true?
Yes, sir. The firstborn child is very eminent in any type of case like
When
that.
you say eminent, what do you mean?
It's considered at the top of the list.
For death or for property?
Anything.
Anything they want to do with the child?
Yes, sir.
And I learned that the police intelligence files on this group of Satanists that Alina described by name gave me descriptions of exactly where each one of them went in the house, what happened, step by step. Intelligence files disappeared out of the Fayetteville Police Department files and also out of Waycross, Georgia, because one of them had been arrested down there.
Was the CID undercover agent involved in the murders?
We were thinking there was one member in the immediate cult who could have been an informant for the CID.
I went on national television, a number of national TV shows, and I had people calling me from all over the country, telling me the same basic story, from the East Coast to West Coast, North and South. And I had people that, what you'd call them multi-generation Satanists. That's somebody who was born into it, mother, father, grandfather, grandmother are involved in Satanism. And adult survivors, that's somebody that gets out, usually has to go into hiding to survive. I had these people call me from all over the country telling me about the ceremonies and about the extent of the satanic movement in this country today.
Now, for those of you thinking this is Geraldo Rivera's satanic panic, let's be clear. Anton LaVey's Church of Satan was not organizing the pedophilia and daycare centers, rock bands hailing Satan, or Richard Ramirez's murder spree. But those things did happen in the 80s. And as my favorite horror film was telling us, the children were in danger, but the parents were not listening.
No, trust us. It's not you I don't trust, it's just...
Being raped by a gun up my vagina, with men standing around me, masturbating on me. That is not only child abuse. I think that's child abuse perpetrated by a group of people who shared a belief system.
What was the?
God knows what it was.
You were how old?
I was less than 5 years old.
There is no such thing as an organized Satanist religion. Satanism, by its very nature, is indefinable, except its opposition in a radical sense, spiritual opposition to a lot of Christianity and basically all monotheistic faiths.
Please, God.
This is God.
So all of a sudden it becomes a satanic panic. But one of the bases of the narratives, well, there are all these people out here who believe in this worldwide Satanist conspiracy, okay? Well, which people? What do you mean by a Satanist conspiracy? You know, it's like, it sounds woo-woo, it sounds ridiculous.
Shem Ham Farash. Shem Ham Farash. Hail Satan. Hail Satan.
And that became almost a pattern, almost like a drumbeat in the 90s. And it still goes on today, you know, but what's appalling is, you know, it's now become an assumption thanks to organizations like Wikipedia. And a lot of this argument can't really be addressed because all somebody has to do is yell conspiracy. It's like yelling communist, and like thought shuts down.
If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist.
I mean, one of the ironies of this is that when the Catholic Church child abuse scandal with the priest came out, like everybody bought into it, but a lot of the data was basically the same. But it was like, it's okay to see some kind of grand conspiracy in the Catholic Church to abuse children, but when you bring up Satanism, it's like it's all a witch hunt. Well, you could say the same thing about the Catholic Church.
And the Oscar goes to Spotlight.
Organized pedophilia and child abuse. I mean, this is a no-brainer if you talk to law enforcement.
In 1989, I was contacted by a gentleman by the name of Ed Weaver, a wonderful Christian man in Lincoln, Nebraska. But he said, we have a real problem here in Nebraska.
One of the grimmest and most disturbing examples of heinous crimes, institutional corruption, and abuse of political power is said to have occurred back in the mid to late 1980s in the heartland of America, and it is known as the Franklin Conspiracy or the Franklin Cover-Up. The conspiracy involved a child pedophilia ring allegedly involving prominent politicians and business leaders in the Omaha, Nebraska area, with ties leading all the way to some of the most powerful circles in Washington, D.C.
John DeCamp's book on the Franklin scandal itself, the Franklin Cover-Up, I believe it was called, was elucidating because John himself was a former Phoenix operative, if I understand, basically within the CIA apparatus in Vietnam, working for William Colby, who became CIA director thereafter. So DeCamp is not an uninformed person to have then investigated this in Nebraska and come up with that first book, which I think inspired some of your research and work.
John DeCamp's book inspired me to go out to Nebraska and check it out. Same with Conspiracy of Silence. Conspiracy of Silence was a documentary that was going to be shown on the Discovery Channel in the UK, and its funding was suddenly, the plug was pulled on it.
It's a web of intrigue that starts in our Holy of Holies, Boys Town, Nebraska, one of the most respected institutions in the United States, and spreads out like a spider web to Washington, D.C., right up to the steps of the nation's capital, the steps of the White House, involves some of the most respected and powerful and richest businessmen in this United States of America. And the centerpiece of the entire web is the use of children for sex and drug dealing and drug couriers, the compromising of politicians, the compromising of businessmen, but worst of all, the corruption of key institutions of government that have the duty and responsibility to make sure these things never happen.
In this particular case, the FBI and the IRS raided the Franklin Credit Bureau, which was a credit bureau established in the minority neighborhood in order to furnish banking and financial opportunities to the minorities. People on the board of directors included people like Harold Anderson, who was past publisher of the Omaha World Herald, other very prominent citizens. And as a result of the raid, there was publicity. Larry King, by the way, was the individual who was president of the Savings and Loan. Not Larry King, alive, CNN, but Larry King, a black man, a fast-rising star in the Republican Party, had sung the national anthem at Texas at the Republican National Convention and New Orleans at the Republican National Convention.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
So ultimately what happened with the Franklin scandal is the Nebraska Senate found out about Lawrence E. King, who was one of the pimps in this pedophile network, and started to dig into this and investigate it. And what happened was the state and both the federal government just came after the senators really, really hard.
I was very disappointed with the way the FBI and law enforcement treated the victims. They, in fact, turned them into the offenders, so to speak. Instead of taking the evidence that was delivered to them by the victims, they seemed to bear down and try to get the victims to change their story.
There was 3 boys that I had seen at one of the receptions at the country center were there, and I'm almost positive they were Boys Town boys. Almost positive. They were there.
I realized what that look in their eye was back then. It was fear. It was fear of every, I mean, I had witnessed, firsthand things that would, destroy this city. People, a position, what I mean? It's not going to be believed, they said. It will not be believed. You will be found guilty of perjury, and they weren't telling me maybe. They were saying, there's no way. You go on with this story, you're going to jail.
The lead investigator of the Senate subcommittee, his plane mysteriously broke up in midair and he was killed. His son was killed after he'd allegedly uncovered some critical evidence to uncover this pedophile network.
National Transportation Safety Board investigators say wreckage from the crash is apparently strewn over a 3/4 to 1 mile long stretch in this field.
The fact that the wreckage is scattered over a large area certainly demonstrates that it did break up in flight.
I managed to acquire all his investigative reports and all his investigative documentation. I had a list of over 60 victims, and it was up to me to put it all together. I drove around the country looking for victims, and these kids were very, very hard to find. Well, now they're young adults, but a lot of them came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and they were turned on to drugs. That was a big carrot for these pedophilic pimps, was give the kid drugs, and then so they were turned on to drugs and repeatedly molested. And ultimately, when they reached a point where they weren't marketable anymore, they were expunged by the networks.
Those perpetrators named by the children formed a ring of rich and powerful pedophiles in Omaha. Men from industry, politics, the media, even the police.
There was a house in Washington, D.C. where a lot of the children were flown to, and then in the house in Washington, D.C., there would be like pedophilic parties, pedophilic orgies. And this house was wired for audiovisual blackmail by a CIA asset named Craig Spence.
And if Washington doesn't have enough to talk about these days, the Washington Times reported today that unidentified White House aides in the Carter, Reagan, and Bush administrations now are being investigated for using the services of a call boy ring.
This is the thing that always bothered me. They claimed it was the largest male prostitution ring in the city that they've ever had uncovered. It was $1 million a year minimum.
Yeah.
And yet they only prosecuted the operator, Henry Vinson, and 3 of his lieutenants, as it were. Mm-hmm. They never went after any of the Johns, the clients. This operation, which was, again, quite large, claimed to have clients that ran from the White House to the Capitol Hill to the State House to the churches, within the media. The prosecutors knew all this stuff. There was approximately 20,000 pieces of 20,000 documents that they had. They sealed the entire record when they found out I was accessing it.
Craig Spence was definitely blackmailing upper echelon people in the Reagan and Bush administrations, and also senators and congressmen in his home.
Did the D.C. Madam ever name names of politicians that were involved, or from his black book, for example?
Some of the people he named were William Casey, who was head of the CIA, and Donald Gregg, who was George Herbert Walker Bush's national security advisor when Bush was vice president.
I see prosecutors who are afraid to prosecute. I see politicians who shouldn't be there. I see institutions of government which are rendered ineffective because they've been compromised or corrupted or threatened or whatever. And I said, I don't know what to do. He said, I'm going to tell you what to do. I said, oh, thank goodness. And he says, get as far away from this thing as you can.
I said, you have to consider the possibility of some danger to not only your reputation, but to your person. I mean, people do react rather violently to some kinds of charges, or particularly if they're true, there's more apt to be a negative reaction than if they're false. If they're false charges, then they can be reacted to in a normal way, a libel suit or whatever. But if there's truth in it, there can be a danger in that situation. We've seen that happen in other cases.
One of the more famous cases, I think, was Johnny Gosch, and there's been a recent film that you helped produce on the question of who kidnapped Johnny Gosch.
Sunday, September 5th, approximately 6 a.m., 12-year-old John Gosch had been delivering papers in this affluent neighborhood of West Des Moines. That was the last time he was seen.
The parents believe the boy is alive and has been kidnapped.
Johnny, we love you. We're waiting for you to come home. We're doing everything in our power to get you back. Take care, babe.
He was the poster child, the first milk carton kid, if I'm correct, and he basically disappeared in the 1980s, and it turns out that he seems to have been trafficked into the same Nebraska pedophile ring, no?
Yes, Paul Benassi, who was one of the kids that was enmeshed in this pedophile network, said that he helped abduct Johnny Gosch. And I think if the police and the FBI had given him any credibility whatsoever, they could have probably found Johnny Gosch. But because the FBI was so concerned about covering up Lawrence King's pedophile network, they couldn't give Paul Benassi any credibility. So ultimately, any leads that were gleaned from Paul Benassi were completely ignored by law enforcement.
And Paul Benassi actually sued Larry King, the key figure in the Franklin government, and actually won the suit, and Lawrence King went to prison.
Paul told me and has drawn for me the living quarters of the White House. The public's not allowed in the living quarters of the White House. There's no question in my mind Paul is telling the truth.
Please go ahead and answer all questions.
I was created by a government program.
Which government program?
Monarch.
And what is Monarch?
Monarch is an operation that was created by the United States government to create spies for other countries. They use children for the purpose that they're easily integrated into multiple personalities because they can dissociate. Monarch is a program that is run by Michael Angelo Aquino, who was an Army Reserve colonel at Presidio. He is also the leader of the Temple of Set. He also runs a child daycare center. He also is involved in human sacrifice.
Paul Benassi was not the only person to claim to have been part of a mind control program directed at creating multiple personalities in children, nor the only one to claim Michael Aquino's involvement.
People who were using Satanism and horrific blood traumas, for example, did not worship Satan per se. That's a religious belief. They're not theologians, they're scientists to do what they do and to carry it out. And I think a good example of that would be Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, the founder of the Temple of Set.
The Temple is the only international satanic religious institution fully recognized by the United States government.
They had the satanic rituals going on. There's an altar in there, and all of the graffiti on the wall would indicate that.
Let's see if I can see it. How'd you find this place?
This was a fortification during World War II. During World War II, where they had gun batteries.
I can see a pentagram painted on the wall. I can see the words Prince of Darkness. On this wall, I see several inverted crosses and other obvious satanic ritualistic paintings.
He was being trained at the War College for Psychological Warfare Division for being able to implement mind control in the military predominantly, but also through people like myself. He was my primary programmer in MK Ultra mind control. It was actually being used to control people in a very traumatic manner.